Tom Ridley thought he was feeding a bear when he left scraps by the tree line, but the massive handprint in the mud told a different story. 5 fingers, an opposable thumb, and a stride length no bear could match. Now something stands at the forest edge each dusk, unmoving, deliberate, watching, waiting, and last night it stepped closer. The first time Tom Ridley saw the eyes, he mistook them for headlights. It was late October in the Cascade foothills of Washington State, 2018, and the mist had settled into the valleys like wool batting. Tom stood on his back porch with a mug of coffee gone cold, watching the tree line 200 yards out. The Douglas firs stood in ranks, their trunks black against the failing light, and somewhere in that darkness 2 points of amber gleamed and did not move. Deer, he told himself, or a coyote. But deer eyes caught light and flickered, and these did not flicker. They held steady, fixed on his house with an attention that felt uncomfortably like intention. Tom was 53, a retired fisheries biologist who had moved to this 30-acre property after his divorce finalized. The isolation suited him. No neighbors within 2 miles, no streetlights, no traffic noise, just the forest and the creek, and the occasional black bear rifling through his compost. He had adapted to the rhythms of this place. The elk bugling in September, the screech owls in the cedars, the Douglas squirrels chittering alarms when the goshawks hunted. He knew the language of this ecosystem, but he did not know what made those eyes. He went inside and fetched his binoculars, ex-military grade with decent low-light performance. When he trained them on the tree line, the eyes were gone. Only darkness and the faint silver etching of mist between the trunks. Tom lowered the binoculars and exhaled. Imagination, fatigue. He had been working long hours cataloguing his field notes from 20 years of salmon surveys, and the screen time was frying his brain. But when he turned to go inside, he heard it. A low, resonant exhalation, almost subsonic, that seemed to carry across the clearing and press against his chest like a hand. It was not wind. It was not an elk or a bear or any animal he had recorded in 2 decades of fieldwork. It was breath. The next morning, Tom found the tracks. They were in the muddy margin of the creek, where runoff from the autumn rains had softened the soil into a perfect casting medium. Tom knelt beside them, his knees sinking into the cold earth, and felt his mouth go dry. The print was 17 inches long, broad across the ball of the foot, with 5 distinct toes. The big toe was massive and set slightly apart, like a thumb, an opposable hallux, evolutionary relic of an arboreal ancestor. The depth of the print suggested a weight well over 400 pounds, and the stride length, which he measured with a tape measure from his tool bag, was 58 inches. No bear, no human, no known primate in North America. Tom sat back on his heels and forced himself to breathe. He had spent his career in the liminal spaces between science and rumor, the places where data thinned and anecdote thickened. He had interviewed loggers who swore they had seen something in the old growth, fishermen who described shapes moving through the alders at dawn, Forest Service rangers who found tree breaks and ground nests they could not explain. He had always listened politely and filed the reports under unverified, because science required evidence, and evidence required repeatability, and these stories never repeated in controlled conditions. But here was evidence. Here was a print in his own creek bed, with dermal ridges visible in the fine silt, pressure differentials consistent with bipedal locomotion, and a mid-tarsal break that suggested a foot structure adapted for both terrestrial and arboreal movement. He took photographs from 6 angles, placed a ruler beside the print for scale, and then sat back and tried to think like the scientist he had been. First principle: what is the most parsimonious explanation? Hoax. Someone with prosthetic feet sneaking onto his property at night to plant evidence. But who and why? He had no enemies, no social media presence, no public stance on cryptozoology that would make him a target for pranksters. Second principle: what does the evidence suggest? The print was deep and evenly weighted, consistent with a living organism in motion, not a static stamp pressed into mud. The dermal ridges showed the kind of fine detail that required either a living foot or a cast made from a living foot. And the stride length suggested an organism with a leg length proportional to a human's, but scaled up by a factor of roughly 1.7. Tom closed his eyes and let the numbers settle. Height extrapolated, 8 to 9 feet. Weight estimated from foot loading, 400 to 500 pounds. Bipedal, plantigrade, with anatomical features suggesting a close evolutionary relationship to hominids. Impossible. Except it was here, in the mud, and it did not care about his disbelief. He spent the rest of the morning documenting the site. He took soil samples, noted the ambient temperature and humidity, sketched the print in his field notebook with obsessive detail. Then he followed the tracks. They led west, into the dense second-growth forest that bordered his property. The prints appeared at intervals where the ground was soft enough to take an impression: mud, moss, the rotted loam around a fallen hemlock. Between these points, Tom had to rely on other signs: broken ferns, disturbed duff, a faint compression in the needle mat that might have been a footfall. He was not a tracker by training, but he knew how to read disturbance. He followed the trail for half a mile, moving slowly, stopping every few yards to photograph and measure. The forest here was thick, with salal and Oregon grape, the canopy closed enough that the understory existed in perpetual twilight. He could hear the creek burbling somewhere to his south, and the distant industrial hum of a logging truck on Route 12. Then the trail ended. Tom stood in a small clearing, no more than 20 feet across, where a windfall Douglas fir had opened a gap in the canopy. Sunlight slanted through the mist, illuminating a patch of ground covered in moss and fern. The track stopped at the edge of the clearing and did not resume on the far side. He circled the space twice, checking for any sign of departure. Nothing. It was as if the creature had simply vanished, or climbed. Tom looked up. The trees here were old enough and thick enough to support considerable weight. Western red cedar, Douglas fir, a massive bigleaf maple with branches like girders. If the creature was adapted for arboreal movement, and the foot structure suggested it was, then the canopy would be a highway, a three-dimensional landscape where it could move without leaving ground sign. He stood in the clearing and tried to imagine it, a bipedal primate, 8 feet tall, moving through the canopy with the ease of an orangutan, its weight distributed across branches that would snap under a human. It was biomechanically possible. Gorillas could climb when necessary. Australopithecines had retained arboreal adaptations even as they moved onto the savanna. There was no evolutionary reason why a large-bodied hominid could not remain partially arboreal, especially in an environment as rich and three-dimensional as the Pacific Northwest. But that meant it was still here, somewhere above him, watching. Tom turned slowly, scanning the canopy. The branches swayed in a wind he could not feel at ground level. The forest was full of small movements, a squirrel leaping, a branch shedding water, the restless flutter of a Steller's jay. He saw nothing that resolved into a shape, no shadow that held the proportions of a body. But he felt it, that same attention he had felt the night before, a pressure in the air, a sense of being observed with an intelligence that recognized him as something more than landscape. He backed out of the clearing slowly, keeping his eyes on the canopy, and did not turn his back to the trees until he was 50 yards away. That night, Tom set up a trail camera. He placed it on a cedar 20 yards from the tree line, angled to capture the clearing between the forest and his house. The camera was a high-end unit he had used for documenting salmon reds, with infrared night vision and a motion trigger sensitive enough to catch a vole. He camouflaged it with moss and bark, checked the battery and SD card, and then went inside. He did not sleep. He sat in the dark living room with a cup of tea and his binoculars, watching the tree line. The moon was a sliver behind the clouds, and the darkness was absolute. He could see nothing, but he listened. At 11:47 p.m. he heard the exhalation again, low, resonant, carrying across the clearing like a note played on a double bass. It was not rhythmic enough to be wind, not mechanical enough to be a device. It was organic, deliberate, and it came from the tree line. Tom raised the binoculars. The infrared illuminator on the trail camera was invisible to human eyes, but it bathed the clearing in a ghostly light, visible through the optics. And there at the edge of the frame, he saw it. A shape, massive, bipedal, standing motionless beneath a Douglas fir. The details were obscured by distance and vegetation, but the proportions were clear. Broad shoulders, long arms, a head that sat forward on the neck, like a gorilla's. It stood perhaps 8 feet tall, and it did not move. Tom's hands shook. He steadied the binoculars against the window frame and tried to resolve the details. The body was covered in hair, dark and shaggy, matted in places as if wet. The face was in shadow, but he could see the faint gleam of eyes catching some ambient light, reflecting it back like a cat's. And then it moved, not toward the house, but laterally, along the tree line, moving with a fluid, effortless gait that covered ground faster than a human could run. It passed behind a cluster of hemlocks and disappeared from view. Tom sat frozen, his heart hammering. He had seen it. Not a blurred photograph, not a shaky video, but the thing itself in real time, 30 seconds of observation that would be burned into his memory forever. He checked the trail camera remotely via his phone. The motion trigger had activated. The footage was there, waiting. The next morning, Tom reviewed the video. The creature appeared at 11:46 p.m., emerging from the forest in a single frame as if it had materialized from the darkness. It stood for 31 seconds, facing the house, then turned and moved along the tree line before exiting the frame. The infrared video was clear enough to capture details: the long arms, the slope of the shoulders, the sagittal crest visible as a ridge along the top of the skull. The face was difficult to resolve, but Tom could see the heavy brow ridge, the flat nose, the jaw that protruded slightly, prognathic like an ape's but less pronounced. It looked like a hominid. Not human, not ape, but something in between. An evolutionary path that had diverged from the human line and adapted to a different ecological niche. Tom played the video a dozen times, taking screenshots, noting details. The gait was bipedal, but with a slight forward lean, the arms swinging in counterbalance. The stride was smooth, efficient, suggesting a locomotor system refined over millennia. There was no sign of struggle or awkwardness. This was an organism perfectly adapted to its environment. He burned the video to 3 separate drives and encrypted them. Then he sat at his kitchen table and tried to decide what to do. First option, report it. Contact the Forest Service, the State Wildlife Department, maybe the Anthropology Department at the University of Washington. Show them the footage, the tracks, the evidence. Let science do its work. Second option, protect it. Say nothing. Destroy the evidence. Because if this creature existed, if it had survived in the Pacific Northwest for thousands of years, without being conclusively documented, it had done so by remaining hidden. And once the world knew, the world would come looking. Tom thought about the media circus that would follow, the cryptozoology enthusiasts, the trophy hunters, the researchers with their dart guns and radio collars. He thought about helicopters with thermal cameras, drones with infrared sensors, teams of graduate students tramping through the forest with GPS units and sample kits. He thought about the creature standing at the edge of the tree line, watching his house. It had not approached, it had not threatened, it had simply observed with the patience of something that had learned to weigh risk and reward over a very long time. Tom made his decision. He would observe back, quietly, carefully, without disturbing the ecosystem he had stumbled into. He would document what he could, learn what he could, and he would tell no one. Because some discoveries were not meant to be shared. Some knowledge carried a responsibility that outweighed the glory of revelation. And he was alone out here, with no witnesses, no oversight, no institution to dictate protocol. For the first time in his life, Tom Ridley was going to conduct science outside the boundaries of science. And he was terrified, and he was exhilarated, and he did not sleep for 3 days. Tom began leaving food. It was a calculated risk, the kind of intervention that violated every principle of observational ecology. Feeding wildlife altered behavior, created dependency, blurred the boundary between wild and habituated. But Tom was no longer conducting wildlife research. He was attempting communication with an organism that might possess theory of mind, and communication required reciprocity. He started with fruit, apples, pears, a bundle of overripe bananas. He placed them in a clearing 40 yards from the tree line, far enough from the house that the creature would not feel cornered, close enough that the trail camera could capture the interaction. Then he went inside and waited. The creature came the next night. The video showed it approaching the clearing at 1:23 a.m., moving with the same fluid gait Tom had observed before. It paused at the edge of the tree line, scanning left and right, then advanced into the open. When it reached the fruit, it knelt, a controlled, balanced descent that suggested powerful leg muscles and excellent proprioception, and picked up an apple. Tom watched the video frame by frame. The hand was massive, easily twice the size of a human's, with thick fingers and a broad palm. The thumb opposed the fingers in a precision grip, manipulating the apple with clear intentionality. The creature sniffed the fruit, then bit into it, chewing with visible molars. After finishing the apple, it gathered the remaining fruit and retreated into the forest. The entire interaction lasted 4 minutes. Tom felt a surge of something between excitement and dread. It had worked. The creature had accepted the offering, which meant it recognized the food as deliberate provision, not random windfall. That implied cognitive sophistication, the ability to infer intentionality, to model the mind of another agent. In short, it suggested that the creature understood that Tom was trying to communicate. Over the next 2 weeks, Tom refined the protocol. He varied the food offerings, vegetables, nuts, dried fish from his freezer. He noted preferences. The creature favored high-calorie items, nuts, dried salmon, apples, and ignored celery and lettuce. It was an efficient forager, optimized for energy return. He also began leaving non-food items: a small mirror, a piece of brightly colored fabric, a wooden puzzle box of the type used in primate cognition studies. The mirror disappeared. The fabric was left untouched. The puzzle box was returned to the clearing, opened, with the small wooden ball inside placed carefully on top of the box. Tom stared at the video of that moment for an hour. The creature had not only solved the puzzle, it had returned it, as if to say, "I understand what you are asking." This was not instinct. This was intelligence, flexible and adaptive, capable of understanding symbolic communication. Tom's hands trembled as he typed notes into his laptop. He was observing something that should not exist, and it was observing him back, and they were beginning to understand each other. On the 18th night, the creature stayed. Instead of retreating immediately after collecting the food, it sat at the edge of the clearing, cross-legged like a human, and watched the house. Tom, observing through binoculars from his darkened living room, felt his breath catch. It was massive, even sitting down, easily 7 feet tall at the shoulder. The hair was dark brown, almost black, matted in places but otherwise clean. The face was visible in profile. A heavy brow ridge, a flat nose with wide nostrils, a jaw that protruded but less than a chimpanzee's. The ears were small and close to the head, the cranium elongated with a pronounced sagittal crest. It looked like Paranthropus, or perhaps Australopithecus, but scaled up and adapted for the temperate rainforest. A robust hominid, built for power and endurance, with a brain case that suggested significant cranial capacity. And it was watching Tom's house with unmistakable focus. Tom made a decision. He turned on the porch light. The creature reacted instantly, rising to a standing position in a single smooth motion. But it did not flee. It stood at the edge of the clearing, illuminated now in the yellow glow of the porch light, and stared directly at the window where Tom stood. Tom raised one hand slowly, palm out, in the universal primate gesture of non-aggression. The creature tilted its head, a gesture so human it made Tom's chest tighten. Then slowly it raised its own hand and spread its fingers. They stood that way for 10 seconds, two primates separated by 200,000 years of evolutionary divergence, acknowledging each other across the distance. Then the creature lowered its hand, turned, and walked back into the forest. Tom sat down hard on the floor, his legs suddenly unable to support him. He had just made contact. First contact. And the creature had responded with intentionality, with understanding, with something that looked unmistakably like recognition. He was not alone in the universe of minds, and the implications of that were so vast, so ontologically destabilizing, that he could not yet process them. The next phase of communication developed rapidly. Tom began leaving drawings. Simple pictographs, a stick figure representing himself, an X over a gun to indicate no harm, a circle around a pine tree to represent the forest. He weighted the paper with a rock and waited. The creature examined the drawings. The video showed it kneeling, picking up the paper with delicate precision, holding it close to its face in the infrared light. Then it set the paper down and, using a stick, drew its own mark in the dirt. A series of lines and dots, abstract but clearly deliberate. Tom photographed the marks and spent hours trying to decode them. They did not resemble any writing system he knew, but the spacing and repetition suggested structure. Perhaps a tally or a map, or simply an assertion, "I can do this too." Over the next several nights, the exchanges became more complex. Tom left a topographic map of the area with his property marked. The creature returned it with additional marks: a cluster of dots in a valley 3 miles north, a line along a ridge, an X over a clear-cut to the east. Tom studied the map, his pulse racing. The dots might indicate a home range, or a den site, or something else. The line along the ridge could be a travel route. The X over the clear-cut might indicate avoidance or danger, or simply a place to exclude from the shared territory. It was communication, primitive, symbolic, but undeniable. They were exchanging information about space, resources, and boundaries, and with each exchange, Tom felt the weight of responsibility growing heavier. He was in contact with an unknown hominid species, possibly critically endangered, and he was doing it alone, without peer review, without ethical oversight, without any of the safeguards that protected both researcher and subject. If he made a mistake, if he exposed the creature to risk, or habituated it to humans, or disrupted its ecology in some unforeseen way, the consequences could be catastrophic. But he could not stop, because this was the discovery of a lifetime, of a century, and he was the only one who knew. 6 weeks into the contact protocol, Tom found the bone. It was placed carefully at the center of the clearing, on top of a flat rock where it could not be missed. A femur, massive and weathered, clearly from a large mammal. But when Tom measured it, he realized it was too large for an elk, too robust for a bear. It was hominid, and it was ancient. Tom brought it inside and examined it under his desk lamp with a jeweler's loupe. The surface was pitted and discolored, consistent with decades or centuries of burial. The bone density was extraordinary, thicker than a human's, suggesting adaptation for supporting massive body weight. There were cut marks near the distal end, deliberate and precise, made with a stone tool. This was not a gift. This was a message. We have history. We have dead. We bury our ancestors. Tom sat back in his chair, the bone cradled in his hands, and felt tears sting his eyes. The creature had revealed something profound. It had culture, ritual, memory. It understood death not as cessation, but as transition, something to be marked and honored. This was not just an animal. This was a people. Tom returned the bone to the clearing the next night, along with a new drawing. A stick figure kneeling beside a mound, with a circle above it to represent the sun or the sky. He did not know if the creature would understand the symbolism, but he hoped it conveyed respect. The creature came that night while Tom watched. It approached the clearing slowly, picked up the bone with both hands, and held it for a long moment. Then it turned toward the house and inclined its head, a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or gratitude or simply recognition. Tom stepped out onto the porch. He did not turn on the light. The moon was nearly full, and the clearing was bathed in silver. The creature stood 40 yards away, holding the bone, watching him. Tom pressed his right hand to his chest, over his heart, then extended it toward the creature, palm up, a gesture of offering, of peace. The creature set the bone down carefully. Then it mirrored the gesture, hand to chest, extended outward, palm up. They stood that way for a moment, two sentient beings acknowledging each other's personhood across the unbridgeable gap of species. Then the creature picked up the bone and walked back into the forest, moving with the quiet confidence of something that knew its home completely. Tom went back inside and wept. Not from fear, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition that he had just participated in something sacred, something that transcended taxonomy and genetics and all the categories by which science organized the world. He had witnessed grief, and he had offered comfort, and it had been understood. The winter came, and with it, complications. The first snow fell in mid-December, and the creature's visits became less frequent. Tom worried. The caloric demands of maintaining a 400-pound body in freezing temperatures were immense, and the forest's productivity plummeted in winter. If the creature was part of a population, and the map marks suggested it was, then winter would be a bottleneck, a time of scarcity and vulnerability. Tom increased the food offerings. He left high-calorie items, smoked salmon, venison jerky he had made himself, bags of mixed nuts. He also left a tarp, folded and weighted, thinking it might provide shelter or insulation. The tarp disappeared. The food was taken, but the creature did not show itself. Tom told himself this was natural. Winter was a time of conserving energy, reducing exposure. The creature was probably denned up somewhere, emerging only when necessary. But he felt the absence like a physical ache. He had grown accustomed to the visits, to the sense of connection, to the knowledge that he was not alone in the forest. On Christmas Eve, the creature returned. Tom saw it on the trail camera, approaching the clearing at dusk. It moved stiffly, as if injured or cold. When it reached the food cache, it ate quickly, mechanically, then gathered the remaining items and turned to leave. But before it disappeared into the trees, it paused and looked back toward the house. It raised one hand, fingers spread, and held the gesture for 3 seconds. Tom, watching the video later, felt his throat close. It was a farewell, or a thank you, or simply an acknowledgement. I see you. I remember you. The creature did not return for 3 weeks. When Tom saw it again, it was not alone. The trail camera captured 2 figures emerging from the forest at 2:14 a.m. on January 17th. The larger figure was the one Tom had been communicating with. The smaller was perhaps 6 feet tall, moving with a slight limp. A juvenile, or a female, or simply another member of the group. They approached the food cache together. The larger creature knelt and inspected the offerings, then gestured to the smaller one, a clear invitation to eat. The smaller one approached cautiously, sniffed the food, then ate quickly, glancing around as if expecting danger. Tom watched the video with a feeling of profound humility. The larger creature had brought the smaller one here, to a known food source, as part of what looked unmistakably like provisioning behavior. It was teaching, or protecting, or simply sharing resources within a social structure. This was not a solitary wanderer. This was part of a family, a group, a society. And that society was struggling to survive in a landscape increasingly fragmented by human activity. Tom looked at his map. at the X marks the creature had made over the clear cuts and developments. He understood now what they represented, not just places to avoid, but places that had been lost, territory that had shrunk, resources that had disappeared. The creatures were being squeezed, pushed into smaller and smaller refugia, their population likely in decline, their future uncertain. And Tom was one of the only humans who knew, which meant he bore a responsibility that terrified him, the responsibility to decide whether to speak or to remain silent, to reveal or to protect, to bring science's full resources to bear, or to guard the secret as the creatures themselves had guarded it for millennia. In February, Tom made a decision. He would document everything, but he would not publish. He would create a record, photographs, videos, measurements, field notes, and encrypt it, store it in multiple secure locations, with instructions that it should be opened only in the event of his death or under specific circumstances he would define later. It was not science as he had practiced it. There was no peer review, no replication, no transparency. But it was the only ethical path he could see, to know, to witness, to record, but not to expose. Because the creatures had survived by remaining hidden, and he would not be the one to destroy that survival strategy. He wrote a letter to accompany the archive, addressed to no one in particular. To whoever reads this, I have documented the existence of a relic hominid population in the Cascade Range of Washington State. I have done so alone, without institutional support, because I believe that exposure would lead to extinction. If you are reading this, circumstances have changed, and you must decide what I could not, whether the world deserves to know, or whether some secrets are meant to be kept. Choose wisely. The burden is now yours. He sealed the letter and stored it with the drives. Then he returned to his vigil. The last exchange happened in March, as the forest was beginning to wake from winter. Tom left a final drawing, a stick figure, himself, beside a larger figure, the creature, with a circle around both of them and lines radiating outward to represent protection or kinship. He added symbols for the sun and moon, for time passing, for continuity. The creature examined the drawing for a long time. Then it took the stick it used for marking and added its own symbol, a handprint, pressed carefully into the soft earth beside the paper. Tom found it the next morning. He knelt beside the print and placed his own hand beside it. The creature's hand dwarfed his, fingers twice as thick, palm twice as broad, but the structure was the same: 5 fingers, an opposable thumb, the architecture of a tool user, a maker, a mind. He took a photograph, then carefully made a plaster cast. It was the last physical evidence he would collect, because that night, when the creature came, Tom met it in the clearing. He did not plan it. He simply walked out unarmed, hands empty and visible, and stood beneath the moon. The creature emerged from the tree line and stopped. They faced each other across 30 yards of open ground, 2 primates alone in the night. Tom did not speak. He simply stood and waited and let the creature decide. After a moment it approached, slowly, cautiously, closing the distance 1 step at a time. When it was 10 feet away, it stopped. Tom could see its face clearly now. The deep-set eyes, the heavy brow, the mouth that was not quite human, but not quite ape. There was intelligence in those eyes, and caution, and something that might have been curiosity or hope, or simple acknowledgement of the bond they had built. Tom lowered himself to his knees, a posture of submission and respect. The creature watched, then knelt as well, mirroring him. They were 5 feet apart now, close enough that Tom could hear the creature's breathing, deep and steady, close enough to see the scars on its hands, the grey streaks in its fur, the wear of age and survival. Tom reached into his pocket slowly and withdrew a small object, a smooth river stone, black and polished, that he had carried for 20 years as a talisman. He held it out on his palm, an offering. The creature extended its hand and took the stone. It turned it over, examining it in the moonlight, then looked back at Tom, and then it did something Tom would remember for the rest of his life. It pressed the stone to its chest, over its heart, and closed its eyes. A gesture of acceptance, of understanding, of something that looked unmistakably like gratitude. Tom pressed his own hand to his chest and bowed his head. When he looked up, the creature was gone, melted back into the forest as silently as it had come. Tom walked back to his house, his legs shaking, his mind reeling, and knew that he had just experienced something that no amount of science could quantify or explain. He had communicated with another mind, another self, and they had recognized each other as kin. The drones came in April. Tom heard them before he saw them, the high-pitched whine of rotors cutting through the morning air, vectoring in from the northeast. He stepped onto his porch and counted 3 of them, commercial quadcopters with cameras mounted beneath, flying in a grid pattern over the forest. His stomach dropped. Someone was surveying his land or the adjacent federal forest with equipment sophisticated enough to generate thermal maps or high-resolution imagery. He grabbed his binoculars and watched the drones work their pattern, systematic and thorough. They were not hobbyist units. These were professional grade, the kind used by wildlife agencies or research institutions, or worse, by private interests looking for resources or thrill seekers hunting cryptids. When the drones finished their sweep and departed to the east, Tom went inside and checked the internet. A quick search revealed a new post on a Bigfoot forum. Thermal anomalies detected in Cascade foothills. Coordinated search planned for late April. PM for coordinates. Someone had detected something, and now they were coming. Tom felt the cold weight of certainty settle over him. His attempts at secrecy had failed. The food cache, the repeated visits, the thermal signature of a 400-pound warm-blooded animal in a predictable location. All of it had created a pattern visible to the right kind of surveillance. He had thought he was being careful, but careful was not enough when technology could see in spectrums invisible to human eyes. He had to warn the creature, and he had no idea how. That night, Tom went to the clearing and dismantled the food cache. He scattered the remaining offerings, kicked dirt over the site, and removed every trace of regular human activity. Then he waited, hoping the creature would come, hoping he could somehow communicate the danger. It came at midnight, emerging from the trees with its familiar, cautious gait. When it reached the empty clearing, it stopped and looked around, clearly puzzled by the absence of food. Tom stepped out of the shadows at the tree line. The creature spun toward him, startled, and Tom raised his hands immediately, palms out. "Easy," he said quietly, though he knew it could not understand his words. "Easy. I'm not a threat." The creature relaxed marginally, recognizing him, but it did not approach. It stood at the center of the clearing, waiting. Tom took a deep breath and tried to think. How do you warn someone of danger when you share no common language? How do you say, "They are coming, and you must leave," when all you have is gesture and symbol? He knelt and drew in the dirt with a stick, a simple sketch. The clearing, his house, and then multiple stick figures approaching from multiple directions, with X marks over them to indicate hostility. He drew an arrow pointing away from the clearing, toward the deep forest, and circled it. Go. Danger. Leave. The creature approached and studied the drawing. It tilted its head, processing, then looked at Tom with an expression he could not read. Tom pointed to the forest, then to the creature, then made a sweeping motion with his arm. Go far. Go deep. The creature made a low sound, almost a rumble, that resonated in Tom's chest. Then it knelt and drew its own symbol in the dirt, a circle with 3 marks radiating from the center, the same symbol it had used weeks ago on the map. Home, or family, or we. Tom felt his chest tighten. It was telling him it could not leave alone. It had a group, a family, a territory it could not simply abandon. He drew more figures beside the clearing, then drew an arrow from them to the deep forest. Take them. Take everyone. The creature looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then it stood and placed one massive hand on Tom's shoulder. The weight was immense, but the touch was gentle, deliberate. The creature held the contact for 3 seconds, its eyes locked on Tom's, and in that moment, Tom understood. It was saying goodbye. Then it turned and walked into the forest, moving faster than Tom had ever seen it move, a loping gait that covered ground with shocking speed. Tom stood alone in the clearing, his shoulder still warm from the touch, and felt the loss like a physical wound. The search party arrived on April 24th. Tom watched from his porch as a convoy of vehicles parked on the logging road 2 miles east. Trucks, SUVs, ATVs with cargo racks. He counted at least 20 people, many carrying equipment cases and camera rigs. Some wore tactical vests, others had rifles slung over their shoulders. They were not scientists, they were hunters. Tom felt a surge of anger so intense it made his vision blur. These people did not care about discovery, about knowledge, about the fragile ecology they were about to trample. They cared about fame, about being the ones to prove Bigfoot existed, about the photographs and the videos and the lucrative media deals that would follow, and they would destroy everything in their pursuit. Tom grabbed his phone and called the Forest Service. "This is Tom Ridley. I live off Route 12 near Clear Creek. There's a large group of armed civilians conducting some kind of search on federal land adjacent to my property. They're carrying firearms, and I'm concerned about safety." The dispatcher took his information and promised to send a ranger. Tom knew it would take hours, maybe longer, and by then the damage might already be done. He hung up and made a decision. He would lead them away. Tom spent the morning creating a false trail. He hiked into the forest, careful to leave obvious signs. Broken branches, disturbed ground, a few tufts of dark animal hair he had collected from a black bear den months ago. He led the trail northeast, away from the valley where the creature had marked its home range, toward a section of dense deadfall where following would be difficult and dangerous. Then he returned to his property and waited. The searchers found his false trail by early afternoon. Tom watched through binoculars as they clustered around the sign, pointing and gesturing excitedly. Then they followed it into the forest, moving in a loose formation, their voices carrying through the trees. Tom felt a grim satisfaction. He had bought time. The false trail would lead them 3 miles in the wrong direction, into terrain so tangled that even experienced hikers would struggle. By the time they realized the deception, if they ever did, the daylight would be gone. But he knew it was a temporary solution. The searchers would return. They would bring better equipment, better tracking, and eventually they would find the real signs, the real territory, unless the creatures were already gone. That night, Tom went to the clearing one last time. He brought no food, no drawings, no offerings. He simply stood beneath the stars and waited, hoping for a sign that the creatures had escaped, that his warning had been understood and heeded. The forest was silent. No exhalations, no footfalls, no presence watching from the shadows. Tom waited for 2 hours, then turned to go. As he reached the edge of the tree line, he saw it. A mark on the trunk of a cedar, carved deep into the bark with a sharp stone. The 3-pointed symbol, the same one the creature had drawn in the dirt, and beneath it a single handprint pressed into soft pitch, preserved like a fossil. Tom placed his own hand beside it, feeling the sticky resin adhere to his palm. The creature's hand was twice the size of his own, but the gesture was clear. "We were here. We remember. We thank you." Tom pressed his forehead against the bark and let the tears come. Not tears of sadness, but of relief and pride, and the devastating knowledge that he had done the right thing at the cost of every ambition he had ever held as a scientist. He would never publish. He would never receive credit for the discovery. History would not remember his name, but the creatures would live. In silence, in secrecy, in the deep forest where they had always lived, and that was enough. The search continued for 3 more days, then disbanded. The local news ran a brief segment. Bigfoot enthusiasts search Cascades, find nothing. The forum posts dwindled. The drones did not return. Tom monitored the trail camera for months, but the clearing remained empty. No visits, no signs, no communication. The creatures had moved on, deeper into the forest, or perhaps into another territory entirely, and they had not returned. He told himself, This was success. He had protected them. He had kept the secret. But the silence was crushing. In June, Tom received a letter. It arrived in a plain envelope, no return address, postmarked from a small town in British Columbia. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note. Dr. Ridley, I know what you protected. I have seen them too, far to the north, and I made the same choice you did. You are not alone in this silence. There are others, scattered across the range, each of us guarding a piece of the truth. We are the witnesses. We are the keepers, and we carry the burden so they do not have to. If you need to talk, to share the weight, you can reach me, but only if you understand. We speak to remember, not to reveal. The letter was unsigned, but it included an encrypted email address. Tom sat at his kitchen table for a long time, the letter in his hands, and felt the isolation he had carried for 6 months begin to lift. He was not alone. There were others who had seen, who had chosen silence, who understood that some knowledge was too dangerous to share. He would reach out, not to organize, not to plan revelation, but simply to witness together, to share the burden of knowing what could not be told, because the creatures deserved their secrecy. And the humans who had glimpsed them deserved not to bear the weight alone. On a cold morning in October, exactly 1 year after he first saw the eyes at the tree line, Tom returned to the clearing. He brought a wooden box, handmade, filled with his field notes and the memory cards from the trail camera. He buried it at the base of the cedar with the carved symbol 3 feet down, wrapped in waterproof layers. A time capsule, a record, a testimony for some future moment when perhaps the world would be ready, when perhaps the creatures would be safe enough that their existence could be acknowledged. But not now, not in his lifetime. Tom smoothed the earth over the box and stood. The forest was gold and crimson with autumn, the air sharp with the promise of winter. Somewhere in the vastness of the Cascades, a family of relic hominids was preparing for the cold months, gathering resources, tending to their young, living the lives they had lived for thousands of years. And Tom Ridley, retired fisheries biologist, keeper of impossible secrets, turned and walked back to his house. He would live here for the rest of his life. He would watch the tree line at dusk. He would remember the weight of that hand on his shoulder, the intelligence in those eyes, the gesture pressed into pitch. He would remember, and he would keep silent, and he would carry the knowledge like a stone in his chest, beautiful and heavy, and entirely his to bear, because some gifts are too precious to share, and some silences protect what words would destroy. If this story moved you, stirred your curiosity, or made you wonder what else might be hidden in the forests we think we know, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to keep exploring the edges of the possible, where science meets mystery and wonder. Drop a comment below. Would you have made the same choice Tom did? What would you do if you found something the world wasn't ready to know? Let's talk about the ethics of silence, the burden of secrets, and the creatures that might still be watching from the shadows. See you in the next story.